George Floyd died May 25th, 2020, and in the wake of his death, there has been a resurgence of the Black Lives Movement. It is clear after a lot of social media and some talking to people that the most important thing for us to do right now is to educate ourselves. It is our duty to understand the epistemology and history of these people so we don't let our prejudice decide the way we treat them. Although I don't know how to do this the right way, I want to do it some way, and from wherever I leap off, I want to learn and commit myself to continuously learning. I want to make this more accessible and easy for other people to also dive in, so there's less excuses and a lot more amplification for the voices happening in this right now. So all of the links, all of the history, everything that I talk about will have a link. I'll probably put it in a Google Docs, and the Google Docs should be accessible by anybody. To properly research and understand, we have to start with history. We're gonna go all the way back to the 1600s, when the colonizers first came. Europe sent Catholic missionaries to try to convert Indigenous people. This doesn't matter where you're Indigenous from. If Europe came to you, they tried to colonize you, and they tried to convert you to Catholicism, or Christianity at this point. Before they had come to Canada or the Americas, they had already taken over Africa, so that's how they were able to take these slaves. You have to understand that the people that were enslaved had no choice in doing so. It wasn't a matter of immigration, it was a matter of kidnapping. European folks would bring slaves from Africa to what is now known Canada and America, and they brought these slaves to help them set up their colonies. They did this through the transatlantic slave trade. Records show that around 3,600 people were already enslaved in the first major settlement in Canada, and a majority of them were Indigenous people, with a few Africans that were being used as well in the trade. By 1763, King George III gave himself proclamation that instructed settlers to limit Indigenous communities and prescribed his own guideline for nation-to-nation treaty negotiation. So what this means is this one guy across the seas made one rule based on him on how to trade with the rest of the world and how to agree on treaties with the rest of the world. It was only based on his words, so everyone else would be disadvantaged after this. He basically gave himself power to expand Europe according to his own agenda. Europe never had any intentions of compromising. Their only goal was to dominate and extract, to expand and increase European wealth. Just to give insight into how bad the transatlantic slave trade was, I'm going to be talking about a ship called the Zong. And the Zong was the name of a ship bought in March 1781 that had transported over 58,000 slaves to the Americas over its course. On one of the instances that is documented that we know of, when they usually set sail on these ships, they would jam like almost 450 people onto these boats, and that was twice the limit capacity of these ships. So people were dying of malnutrition and disease and dehydration and just abuse because they hadn't brought enough resources to sustain everyone on the ship, and also a lot of people died. The crew decided to throw the enslaved people overboard the ship to protect the remaining sailors from starving and dehydration. That was their reasoning for doing this. And in the span of a few days, more than 140 people were thrown over, and a few other captives jumped themselves, and these were all Africans. The reasons the sailors decided to throw the Africans overboard instead of just letting them die by I don't know, not feeding them or something, is because they could only claim loss of property and collect insurance money if they were thrown overboard. They could only collect insurance money if it was loss of property. It couldn't be like damaged property. It couldn't be if they died of disease or like malnutrition or starvation. If this happened once, it's happened again. It's just we'll never know about it because these people didn't have the resources to document any of this, and like we don't know what it was like on the ships. And a lot of the people who like could have shared oral tales about that, like any actual publication would have been destroyed and the people probably would have been killed. Because this incident was so heinous, it was heinous, but it was also more insurance fraud. And because they committed a larger crime in that sense, there was actually documentation about this. It was only documented because they were trying to attempt insurance fraud, and the insurance company was trying to get like money out of it. They eventually lost, but when the ship had docked onto land, there had been reports that they had like enough food and water. They had remaining food and water. So that sparked a little bit more curiosity and it brought on a case. And the case itself sparked a lot of public attention at that point. That case was used by British abolitionists to try and spread awareness. But this instance also only really offers a glimpse into how bad, like how atrocious these standards were. Like you're being kidnapped, you're being shoved on this ship, and then you're watching everyone around you die. And in the very last moment, the people who decide to jump overboard themselves, it was like their last chance of trying to hold on to their own individuality. I don't know, I can't speak for them, but that part definitely hits a different note. Moving on, March 25th, 1807, the slave trade was abolished. So this had been already 200 plus years of them using the transatlantic slave trade to bring enslaved people to Canada to work as slaves. It took 200 years. 200 years is a long time. I'm going to do a quick pan over to how the Indigenous people were doing. From the 1600s to the 1800s, like the colonizers were trying to get like buddy-buddy with them so the colonizers wouldn't die and would know how to like sustain themselves on the land. But there had been a lot of growing tension with the Indigenous people and the colonizers because I think most Indigenous people realized the ideology of the Western colonizers and how they were really here to use and extract the land. So by 1812, there was a war between the Indigenous and the colonizers, and the Indigenous were fighting to keep their land, but they were only asking for like, shared ownership in alliance to the Allies and independence. So they were willing to share, but it wasn't like get the heck off of our land. It's more like, hey, don't take all of our land and also like just let us be our own people. And during this time, 10,000 Indigenous people died, either of being killed or of disease. If you ever watch, I don't know, Gun, Germs, and Metal or something in like grade school, this is like basically that, but we only watched like one video on that. For the 1812, the Indigenous people had signed the Treaty of Gaunt with the colonizers to return some of the land and return rights to the Indigenous people, but that treaty just was ignored. That treaty ended up it went nowhere. In 1831, that was when the first residential school was opened. In 1834, August 1st, that was when slavery was finally abolished in Canada. 1857, that was the Gradual Civilization Act for the Indigenous population. And this was kind of it was the start of Europe trying to instill Western ideologies into the Indigenous people and their way of life. But it was more like a, hey, if you do all of these things, we're gonna give you rights. It was an effort to use government policy to assimilate Indigenous people to European economic and social customs, aka capitalism and patriarchy. They tried to get Indigenous people to give up their treaty rights in trade for land property and voting. The requirement to apply for this was to be a man, well-spoken in English, and was a good moral character and education. So this is a very fancy way of saying like, you have to be a dude, screw women, You have to speak our language. You have to be good in our standards. Because Western people already thought that Indigenous were like barbarians, even though they weren't. The Easterns wanted the Indigenous people to be educated to their Western ideals. That's like why the residential schools were there. All of this aimed to remove the ancestral right of Indigenous people and absorb them into Western ideals. In 1867, that was the British North American Act, and this was when the British Parliament created Canada by passing the legislation to be a self-governing federation. This basically means some random country across the world is like, okay, that is ours, we're gonna name it
Canada.
Thank you. Basically, Britain gave Indigenous community and land responsibilities to its own federal government, independent from Indigenous people, even though it's literally their land. In 1876, that is the Indian Act, and the Indian Act was like the most influential thing on their community. It's like the thing that they try to teach you in school, but you're never gonna learn it, or you're not gonna remember it because like they don't teach it in a way that like makes you care. And they also teach it in a way where it's like, oh, this was like so long ago, but it's okay now. We love Indigenous people. A lot of the things on the Indian Act had barely been undone, and the effects have definitely not been undone. And it still discredits different groups of people based on hierarchy that isn't even based on their own culture. Like, Indigenous people are based on matriarchy, and you're trying to push them into this matriarchy, and you're traumatizing generations. The Indian Act was a federal law passed that gave the government control over Indigenous status, councils, reserves, and the power to control the affairs of day-to-day life in reservations. It took away any Indigenous self-government system, which was their bands and council, and an Indigenous Indian was defined as a male of Indian blood. An Indigenous woman who married out would lose their own status, and anyone of status who became a doctor, lawyer, clergy got rights and privileges. Women had less freedom because if they married out, then they would lose their status, but if a man married out, they would not lose their status. If you were educated by Western standards, then you would have rights and privileges that would make your life easier, even though they would still mistreat you in society. And after that, there were several amendments made to the Indian Act. And in 1880, Indigenous people were required permits to buy or sell products. Residential schools became mandatory in 1884, and children were forcibly removed from their homes and placed into these residential schools. And we also have heard about residential schools. The children get torn away to be taken care of by these priests that rape them and tell them that every bad thing that happens to them is because of their origin as Indigenous, and like spit them out and make them try to conform and assimilate to Western ideology. Pretty messed up. 1885, Indigenous people were not allowed to leave reserves without permission, and they were also banned from spiritual ceremonies, which is a very important part of their culture and identity. And in 1914, Indigenous people were required permission to wear traditional clothing. In 1918, the government gave itself power to lease out Indigenous land for farming. They're just trying to take away more land. And if you wanted to fight against that, in 1927, the government passed another Act amendment to ban Indigenous people from hiring legal representation without the government's approval. So the government took your land because they wanted to use it for farming, and you weren't okay with it, but you tried to take it to court. Based on their system, they would choose your lawyer. You wouldn't get to choose your lawyer. That's rigged. Taking a shift back to our Africans. During this time, thousands of slaves had seeked haven through the Trans-Canada Railway because the USA had passed the Fugitive Slave Law in 1793, and Canada had abolished slavery by 1834, August 1st. So, from 1793 to 1910, a whole bunch of enslaved people were brought into Canada until 1910, when the government had passed the Immigration Act that stopped undesirable people from entering Canada. By 1955, that was the first change to that law when they launched the West Indian Domestic Scheme, which allowed women to immigrate over into Canada in exchange for 1 year of service as a domestic worker. And this leads us into the 1960s, and a lot of things were happening in the 1960s. But at the start of the 1960s, the Indigenous people were finally given the right to vote without losing their status and treaty rights, and this had been something they were fighting for almost a century, just their own freedom and rights. The 1960s also marked the time of the 60s Scoop, which was the drastic acceleration of Aboriginal children representation into the child welfare system because of poor measures and training for child services. Children were often taken without the consent or notice of their family, and social workers weren't required and wasn't given any type of special training to be working with Indigenous folks and communities. So when these social workers that were accustomed to Western ideals were walking into Indigenous households, they thought living standards were poor compared to a normal Western well-stocked pantry because these Indigenous communities were living off of dried meats and berries as they would have before because they took from the land around them. During the 60s Scoop, the population of Indigenous children in the welfare system went from 0.1% to over 30%, and 70% of these children were adopted by non-Indigenous people, and these children were denied their heritage. Canadian kids had a tendency to be adopted out into American families, and kids were often told that they were of French or Italian descent by their families. And these kids, if they had a sneaking suspicion that they weren't French or Italian, these kids couldn't look at their own birth records without the consent of their parents. In retrospect, this seems like a pretty obvious attempt at mass assimilation of their child population, but unfortunately, even now, they're still going through something called the Millennial Scoop, and the Indigenous population in the welfare system had jumped now to about 50%. So this situation hasn't even fully been dealt with. Another thing that happened in 1860 was Africanville being demolished for urbanization. Africanville was a specific settlement that Black folks were placed or encouraged to group by the government, and by demolishing these communities for urbanization, this obviously resulted in everyone who lived there being displaced, and none of those people would have habitats anymore. But also by demolishing these settlements, they were taking away any sort of gain they've made in society, any sort of wealth that they've created in their community or structure that they've created in their community. All of that was destroyed. And in 1964, America passed their Civil Rights Act and had abolished the Jim Crow laws. So this was the start of when Canada started following along with leaving behind the Jim Crow laws. In 1965, Queens stopped enforcing anti-Black restrictions. Also in 1965, previous restrictive covenant clauses that stopped people of color from owning or living on their own property was also abolished. And in 1967, the previous discriminatory immigration system was also finally dropped. So they couldn't say no to undesirable people coming in anymore. 1980s was the first time the policies that had allowed and sanctioned the 60s Scoop were finally addressed and changed, but this took 20 years of watching children going into the welfare system for no reason. In 1982, that was when Canada had passed the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom Act. 1983 marked the last racially segregated school, which was in Nova Scotia. But although the segregation laws had been abolished, the community still tried to intimidate and deny Black folks access to local schools. In 1990, there was a situation called the Oka Crisis. It was a 78-day land dispute between the Mohawk community and the Oka mayor of Quebec. This was basically because the Oka mayor and developers wanted to clear an area of pine that was in the Mohawk territory to build a golf course, and when they brought this to court, the court had sided with the Quebec mayor to build this golf course, although it impeded Indigenous treaty rights that they had already established. And in 1996, that was the end of residential schools. That was 165 years of residential schools. In 1996, that means someone who's 24 would have experienced that. We wouldn't even know. Like, people who aren't Indigenous wouldn't know. And it's probably not something that most of them parade around and tell people. And we ignore the traumas of those places and expect everyone that experienced it to work and function and hide all of that and live in society as normal. Should be a lot more measures put in place to help these people heal. In 2016, the government signed the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. That was 2016, this was 4 years ago, and that was the first time they signed a recognition for Indigenous rights. But even now in 2020, the Alberta government agreed to sign the passing of Bill 1, which again allows the government to go into
Wet'suwet'en
territory to build a pipeline despite treaty agreements. It's not a matter of how much. First of all, we don't need that many more pipelines. We should move to a different economy. Second of all, you have a treaty, you have an agreement, and you're just going to pass bills under everyone's noses to get what you want, just to build another pipeline. Just figure something else out. Why not use the brains and privilege that you've already spent years honing to come up with a different plan that doesn't risk a community of people? That's what I'm saying. I think this is a very brief span of history, and it's by no means in depth enough. Like, I can only point at the things that had happened, but I can never explain the atrocities and the pain and the trauma and hurt that's felt under all of those instances. Like, we'll never know. These communities, specifically Indigenous and Black, their leaders were killed, so the new generations don't have leaders to look up to. They're starting from ground zero every time because we've kicked them down every single time. And they had an entire system figured out. They had an entire way of life figured out. And the Western Europeans, the Europeans just decided to come fuck that shit up. Destroy all of it. And now every time these group of people try to rebuild themselves, they systematically and very purposefully shoot that down every time. So I encourage a lot of people to research this more. These are centuries of centuries of experience that we don't understand and we don't know and we won't get to know. We can only look back and hope that we change that for the future. Although the past should not be forgotten, because you can never appreciate your own standing in life and appreciate where you came from and be empathetic towards the struggle of other people if you don't understand the reasoning of their struggle and that it's not because of their own doing.